Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Joanna and today we're looking at what happens to sci-fi spaceships that manage to reach the end of their lifetime. Typically, what happens in real life is that vessels get scrapped at ship-breaking yards once the hull reaches the end of its lifespan thanks to the effects of corrosion and metal fatigue. That way, important parts can be extracted and the raw materials recycled for other uses, though the methods used vary wildly across the globe thanks to differences in environmental and safety laws. You may think all this seems a bit unnecessary since spacecraft don't have to worry about aging because there's no rust, right? Well, yeah, there's no corrosion from that specifically, but there are a whole host of other problems to contend with. Firstly, space is a harsh thermal environment because there's no atmosphere to even things out. Spacecraft in orbit around Earth have to contend with hitting 120 degrees Celsius in sunlight and down to minus 150 or so in the shade. There's also all the unfiltered ultraviolet light and increased radiation which can degrade various materials, not to mention the risk of physical impacts from micrometeorites or combat. And if your spacecraft moves around, it's going to be experiencing stress from engine burns, though these are going to be less impactful compared to what ocean-going vessels have to contend with. All these factors, as well as budgetary concerns, are why NASA is planning to decommission the International Space Station. It's getting old, and is actually way beyond its original planned lifetime, so the plan is to drop it into the sea, which is certainly one way of disposing of a ship. But we're talking about shipbreaking, and we start our sci-fi journey in the Mass Effect universe at Corliss. This is explicitly a planet whose main economic activity, beyond all the crime, is scrapping and recycling old starships. The place is littered with them, very much taking after the real-life places where ships are unceremoniously beached and torn apart. The Blue Sun's mercenaries also use the quieter parts for hiding weird experimental stuff like developing Krogan armies or testing new weapons on all the hulks lying around, which is certainly a real-world concept too. Obsolete tanks are used as range targets all the time, and old warships were used in nuclear tests to see what a detonation near them would do. Next up we have to mention Star Wars because it is jam-packed with junk worlds and shipbreaking, covering all eras of the setting. The dilapidated Lotho, where Darth Maul became a spider, is one such old trash world, and Raxus Prime in the expanded universe is another. That latter one even had an ancient Sith weapon that could suck up life energy buried there. Moving on beyond the Clone Wars, and we get into the era where the Empire is busy breaking down all their old ships because they have their new Star Destroyers. This can be seen now and then on Ferrix, though in Andor it's much more of a background world-building vibe, with the main setting being the town. Bracca in Jedi Outcast and The Bad Batch is much more overt with all the huge Republic hulks everywhere. Apparently this was a deliberate choice to clearly indicate the time period for the Jedi Outcast game, which I guess is important when you're telling stories across every era of the setting at the same time. Sticking with the early Imperial age though is Rebels with Reclam Station. This place plucked the hyperdrives from old Republic starships like Y-Wings before incinerating the leftovers. I'm not sure why the raw materials there were just burned and thrown away. Why not recycle that too if you're going through all the effort of destroying the ships? Perhaps recycling was just not worth the investment, and it was more prudent to rapidly dispose of anything that could be used against the Empire in case, well, this happened. After the Galactic Civil War, there was once again many things that needed scrapping. Jakku is a bit different since the ruins of the last Imperial fleet just happened to be left to rot here, then scavengers picked them apart over the years. Season 2 of The Mandalorian shows Migs Mayfield serving time at the Carthon chop fields, which was a source of material for the second Death Star before it got a whole load of TIE fighters dumped on it. Interestingly, they all seem to have had their solar panels removed before being dumped here. Well, except for that one on the Walker. There's some neat behind-the-scenes stuff for this planet. The mid-ground scrap is a miniature set projection mapped onto screens, and those walkers in the background were stop-motion models. No idea if they ended up staying that way for the final episode or if they were just used as references, but it's still pretty cool. The third season of The Mandalorian showed yet more old Imperial stuff being taken apart, but this time it was Star Destroyers being stripped of parts in dry dock on Coruscant, which is a huge change from every other shipbreaking yard we've seen before, which were all much more haphazard and junky. This continued in Ahsoka with the Corellian shipyards, which were also working on Star Destroyers, specifically removing hyperdrives for use in New Republic ships. These items are proving to be one of the most important and complex parts of a ship if both the Empire and the New Republic are shown to be recycling them. And then the really big ones got stolen and used for the Eye of Sion. Something else I want to highlight here is that the shipyard supervisor, this guy with the space clipboard, mentions that salvage parts fund New Republic rebuilding efforts. If he's to be believed, that means that even on a large corporate scale, there's a thriving market for second-hand ship parts. Or perhaps third-hand, or fourth-hand. There's so much scrapping and salvaging and recycling going on in Star Wars at all levels, from just getting by in the Outer Rim to vast core world enterprises. It's clearly a central part of the galactic economy. That means that some of these valuable parts, like the hyperdrives, have just got to be being reused over and over and over. How often are new ones being built? Do they just last forever? Is this a cause or symptom of the apparent technological stagnation of the setting? That's a pretty neat chain of thought to follow, but that's for another time because we got ships to break. In space. That's hard? Absolutely cannot forget about this game because it's literally all about dealing with old ships and recycling them. You gotta work out the best way to extract all those juicy, expensive components, and it's all set as being part of an incredibly dangerous job in a crushing, hyper-capitalist nightmare. Absolutely immaculate vibes. Another thing you can do with old ships is to repurpose them. They may not be fit for purpose as, say, military vessels, and refitting them to new standards just isn't worth it. But perhaps they can serve some other role, like the heavily armed Tau merchant fleet in 40k. Thank you, commenter, who mentioned that on a previous video. You know who you are, but I can't remember your name, sorry. This salvaging of hulks is also something that gets done by scrapper and pirate factions who just do not have any other good options, so they make do with everyone else's leftovers. The behind-the-scenes stuff around Star Trek Picard Season 3 had an example of direct reuse of ship parts with the transfer of components to the Titan A. In the show itself, there was also the Fleet Museum, which featured a number of notable preserved vessels, both from stories we know and those we haven't seen, which is a nice touch. Bet you thought I'd mention Galactica as my museum ship example here, didn't you? The final thing that can be done to dispose of real ships is to clean them up and deliberately sink them to create an artificial reef. Though that does come with the downside of probably causing some form of environmental contamination, and it's a bit more difficult to do with spaceship. Alternatively, they could just be left to decay in a ship graveyard, or eternally forgotten about after being placed in reserve or after being mothballed. As we can see, there's many ways to dispose of a spacecraft that has reached the end of its life, and all options can be used to enhance the feeling of a setting or a place within it. Is it somewhere where everyone is listless and there's just wrecks left lying around everywhere? Or is it very industrious with loads of active salvaging efforts going on? Perhaps there's a transitional period happening with a new polity breaking down the idols of the previous one. The huge remains of old vessels themselves also make for fantastic settings for spooky stories or those infused with criminals wishing to hide. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our frigate and spacefighter design reference books. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.